Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or add our RSS feed to your podcatcher of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter or Google+, and please give us feedback. You can leave us a review on iTunes to help other people find the show, send us a tweet or an email, leave us a message on Google+, or you can join our community. Visit discourse.pythonpodcast.com for your opportunity to find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, and propose show ideas. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. Linode is sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. I would also like to thank Hired, a job marketplace for developers and designers, for sponsoring this episode of Podcast.init. Use the link hired.com/podcastinit to double your signing bonus. Your host today is Tobias Macey. Today we are interviewing Mariano Guerra. Mariano, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So as you said, I'm Mariano. Originally, I'm from Córdoba, Argentina. Now, for the last couple of years, I've been living in Stuttgart, in Germany. I'm a software engineer, and I like mainly playing with programming languages. I like to create them also. I also like distributed systems and also, all of the parts of software, like backend, front end, everything in between.
With the wealth of interesting projects and tools, it's kind of hard to pick a particular niche to focus on because there are just so many interesting areas to explore. It's also interesting how many of our guests and how much I've heard about Argentina coming up in reference to various Python communities. And it seems like there's a pretty strong community of Python users down in Argentina. Yeah,
it's quite big. In the Spanish-speaking countries, is I don't know if the biggest, but a really big one. And also, the name is Python Argentina, but we have members from all over the Spanish-speaking countries. So it's not only Argentina in that sense.
Okay. And Stuttgart is a bit of a difference from Argentina. I'm just curious if you'd like to share how you ended up over in that neck of the woods.
Yeah, sure. I came to Germany for the first time like 6 years ago for a scholarship for 6 months. I studied here in the 6 months in the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and then went back. And in this travel, I met my girlfriend, current girlfriend. She's also from Argentina. And we went back, we got our degree. And yeah, we liked the traveling because while we were here, we traveled around. Like one nice thing about Europe is that it's small and you can cross countries really easy. So, I got my degree and I went to work a couple of months to England. And when she visited me, she applied for some jobs here and she got a job in Stuttgart. So I moved and I work from home, so I can be here and enjoy like the nice airports and that everything is close by.
Yeah, being able to work from home as a developer is definitely very convenient in that respect.
Yeah.
So how did you get introduced to Python in the first place?
I guess it's a combination of things. When I started with Linux, 15 years ago, 2000, I installed Red Hat 6.1, I think. And Red Hat, I think they still do. All of the scripts and automation they do it in Python. And when I was playing around with Red Hat, because at that point you had to play around a lot with the software, with Linux, I saw like every single utility was written in this Python programming language. At that point, I think it was 1.5 or 2.0 or something like that. And then so I came back and I just read the scripts to try to figure out how stuff worked, but I didn't know the language. And at that point, I didn't have internet, and also I didn't know anyone who was a programmer. I just had a C book and I started with C. And so then I learned assembly and then C++, and then I started studying at the university and then learned Java. But with Java, I got this feeling of like complexity. And then like someone, so a sysadmin told me like, we use Python for automation. And then another person said, hey, have you checked this software? It's made in Python. And I kept hearing about Python and here and there. And a friend of mine told me, yeah, come to a meeting. The labs of the university are presenting the projects they're working on. So they presented what they're working on, and one of them was one person doing research on this Python programming language. So I say, okay, here it is again. So we applied to work on that group, and that was like 2004. So we entered, and our job was to pick one UI toolkit and one web framework. We picked GTK at that point and TurboGears. Like we did a presentation of all the alternatives and which one was good and why we picked the ones we picked. So we did some software for the labs. They managed like equipment and stuff with TurboGears at that point. And then I wanted to try GTK more in depth. So my brother was using Windows at the moment, and he told me, yeah, I would use Linux only if there was a decent MSN Messenger client for Linux. So I took a weekend and I made a joke, a really long joke. I made a really simple MSN Messenger client for him, and I say, here you have one. Now you can switch. And he started laughing. He switched and he started using it and started giving me feedback. And I was like changing all the things he said really fast to make it work for him. And at some point I blogged about it, and like people really started to use it. That became MSN, which was really popular at that point. And yeah, we got like hundreds of thousands of users, like lot of contributors. It was translated to many languages. Then it grew and learned to work with Gtalk and Facebook Messenger. But then when MSN closed, we just left the project die a peaceful death, let's say. Mm-hmm. The code is still there and it runs on Mac, on Windows, on Linux, and everything. But yeah, the main purpose is not there anymore, so we are not supporting it. So yeah, that's how I got into Python. And and that at some point there, I think when I was at the labs, I joined Python Argentina, the user group. And yeah, the cool thing about Python Argentina first is that the people there are awesome, but also that they organize a lot of events. They have this idea of federal group. So I'm a member also, organize like Pi Days where you can set up one day of talks, normally in universities, to talk about Python and try to bring new people. It's to tell students mainly, or people that are interested in the language, about Python. So are all introductory talks, and there were a lot of them. And then like PyCons started happening, I think in 2009. And then like PyCamps, and yeah, so I stayed. I came for the language and stayed for the community. I'm still hang around on the chat, helping people, maintaining some projects, and just because the community is so cool.
So I brought you on today to talk about your language, and actually I'm going to pause for a second and just to make sure I'm pronouncing it the right way. So how do you pronounce the name of your language?
It's a play of words. It's Efene.
Okay.
It's because my first project is MSN,
okay.
And it's how you pronounce in Spanish MSN, mm-hmm. And Efene is how you pronounce in Spanish FN, mm-hmm. the two letters.
Right.
So that's the play of words.
So Efene is a language that runs on the Beam VM, which for people who aren't familiar is the proper name for the Erlang VM. And in the documentation, you mentioned that it's at least partially inspired by the Zen of Python. I'm wondering if you can explain how that inspiration manifested and some of the process that was involved in the creation of Efene.
Yeah, sure. So about Python, I like, as I said, the community, but also like the mindset. There's this thing I like, I don't know who said it, but you should learn languages that change the way you think about programming. And in some sense, Python changed the way I think about programming in terms of simplicity. Like that's the main thing I like about Python. But also like when you read the Zen, there's so much there to learn. When I was starting, like I improved a lot as a programmer with Python. And if you just follow the Zen when you are thinking about solving a problem, Like it's a good guidance. And at some point I was working at the work doing Python, and someone newer than me in Python was asking me questions, and I kept replying with the Zen of Python. And he said, "Oh, these Python programmers they talk like Zen monks. They always reply in these Zen ways." So I like a small text that guides you when you are trying to solve a problem, and like you see some code and you say this is really complex or really complicated, and then the Zen comes at you and say this shouldn't be like this, or this is too nested and stuff like that. So I really like the idea of the Zen of Python. It's a really small text, really nicely written, that like concentrates what Python is or what people think Python should be. So I like to bring this idea of the Zen, because I'm not really good at writing Zens or haiku or stuff like that. So I just say, okay, let's adopt everything I like about the Python community instead of trying to come up with some new idea. For example, like Ruby has this idea of optimize for programmer happiness, and which I find really interesting, but I prefer the simplicity thing of Python. So one thing that keeps coming back on Efene is not invent anything new. Just pick stuff from other languages that works and that I like, of course. So I bring stuff I like about the Python community a lot, something in JavaScript and something from the Erlang language, and something also from Clojure. I don't know if you can see it in the code, but some ideas from the Clojure community are really interesting too. And I forgot the second question.
Just wondering if you can explain some of the process that was involved in the creation of Efene, some of the concerns that you have to think about when you're designing and building a new programming language.
I started, it was an accident, like every single thing I do, like MSN also. I started learning Erlang in 2006, I think. No, a little bit later. And I was finding it really hard to find an excuse to use the language. Like I learned a lot from Python while doing this lab project and while doing MSN, and I couldn't find one excuse to actually use Erlang for something real to learn about it. So I was looking for something to do, and as I said, I like languages, so I did a calculator. Like you enter like formulas, and it did the calculation for you, and it's actually on GitHub. Still the code there. You can go commit by commit, seeing how it evolves. And at some point I say, yeah, I could add like variables, and I added variables. And then I said, okay, I can add functions, and I added functions. At this point it was interpreted. So I said, let's see if I could compile this to bytecode actually. And when I managed to compile to bytecode, I say, okay, there's a language here. So I was invited to Erlang Factory London in 2010 to talk about it, and I felt this pressure to actually have something more interesting to show, so I rewrote it as a language from scratch. And then like there was some interest, so I kept working on it on and off since. I stopped at some point when like Elixir picked up, and also because I was really busy working on my personal startup. So when I saw Elixir, I said, okay, there's the reason I created Efene was to make it easier for people coming from mainstream programming languages or scripting languages to come to the Erlang ecosystem, because at first Erlang looks really alien to people in some sense. So when I saw Elixir, I said, okay, they are doing the job. But at some point when I started having a lot of some more free time, I saw that there was still a niche on my ideas of what a nice programming language for the Erlang VM would be. So I started working on it again for the last year and a half. And yeah, it's almost finished. And I think it's like there are like 4 main programming languages on the Erlang VM: LFE, Lisp flavored Erlang, Elixir, and Efene. And I forgot about another one. I don't know how it's pronounced, Hoxa or Yoxa, or I don't know how it is. It's another Lisp. And I think each has its own characteristics and strengths. So that's why I still work on Efene, because I think there's a place for Efene in the ecosystem. I'm not trying to compete against the other languages.
And so that mostly answered my next question about what your inspiration was. And so you said it was essentially an accident. And
I like designing programming languages. I have a lot of hidden failures that are not public, but the first one was one I did 15 years ago or more, that compiled straight to assembly, and then that was FN. And then in the middle, I did one a scheme that compiled with the PyPy toolchain. There's a talk around, and the code is available online. So yeah, I like programming languages, and also I like to think on different points of view. Like if I have this, if I want to focus only on this characteristic, how the programming language would be. If I have this constraint, what programming language can I build with this? If I want something that focuses on one topic or something. And then FN is one that the constraints are that it's really easy, really simple, really regular, looks familiar for people coming from Python, JavaScript, or Algol or mainstream programming languages. And yeah, that it's easy to read, easy to pick up, the readability of Python, that you read the code, and even if you don't know the syntax, you can see what's going on and stuff like that. That's the main focus on the language. And what I try to focus on Efene is many people complain about the syntax of Erlang and some other things related to the syntax. And you hear the creators of the Erlang language saying, but Erlang is really simple. The syntax is really simple. You can learn it in a day. And when I was doing FN and trying to do the same ideas of the syntax, but the idea of Erlang, the language, the syntax is pattern matching and case clauses and guards. So it's only these three things, and you write in English, you have commas and colons and semicolons and colons, and that's all you have. So I tried to extract these ideas they had when they didn't decide the syntax. The syntax was mostly inspired by Prolog. So I say, okay, what if I try to extract what they are trying to say and create a different syntax that may be more approachable for people that are used to these Algol languages. So that's the current state of FN. Is based on that. Note that I say FN because many people say FN too. So I tend to say FN, but the correct pronunciation is Efene.
Okay. And that also brings up an interesting point, because in my listening to some of the communications from the Elixir community, I've seen some people mention how in some ways it can be a bit of a disservice having the more familiar syntax, because it can kind of hide some of the cognitive differences and how you actually approach a problem in Erlang-based languages because of the more functional and distributed nature, whereas in languages like Python or Ruby, you're generally a more procedural or iterative in the approach, and so that can actually cause some initial pain when you're trying to write something the same way as you would write it in Python, but it turns out that the way it is actually executed and the way you should be thinking of it is somewhat different. So I'm just curious if you've had that experience or had anybody mention that to you.
Yeah, that's something I keep thinking about, but I have two views. It's true that if I could make Efene have the syntax as closely or as similar as possible to Python, and then you have this problem that you say, hey, I know the syntax, so people can think, I know this syntax, so I know the semantics of the syntax. I know what happened here. So they will write something and it won't work, or it will work differently, and they will say, hey, there's something weird here then. So I didn't copy the Python syntax or the JavaScript syntax or any other syntax 100%, because you will have that. You read something, and because you know what that does in Python, you think what it does in Erlang or Efene. So you have this trap of a familiar syntax making you think you know what it means. But in this case, in Efene, like variables are uppercase, so you there go like, okay, this is something different. And then like lowercase words are atoms, and it's explained in documentation. So I follow in that part. I follow the Erlang approach, the Erlang syntax. So there you see a difference. And Efene is functions first. I don't try to make something like objects or classes or object-oriented notation, so you won't fall in that trap. But on the other hand, like I try to do it like its own syntax, that you say, okay, this is a different language. This is not Python for the Erlang VM, but where you can say, okay, like the rules and the syntax, and my fingers are used to write like data like JSON and functions and the operators like plus and the arithmetic operators and OR and 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 the binary operators. People are used to read them in a way, so I use that because they mean the same thing. But when it comes to like the case statement or pattern matching or function definition with different function clauses and stuff like that, I don't reuse a similar syntax from another language because I want to make it clear that it's something else. But on the other hand, when I was learning Erlang, I had this problem that it's the other side of this argument, which is you are fighting three battles at the same time. First, you're learning a different semantics, like the semantics of the Erlang Virtual Machine, which are really different from like JavaScript or any mutable object-oriented or imperative language. Then you're fighting the tooling, because the tooling in Erlang is quite different. It's improving right now, but it's different. You have to get used to that. And then you're fighting also the syntax. So your brain is trying to learn three things at the same time. The syntax of a language that is really different from what you know, the semantics of the language that if you come from imperative object-oriented languages, it's different from what you know, and the tooling, which it used to be really bad, but it's getting really good lately. There's a big push on tooling lately that's improving. So like you are going to stop learning Erlang and move to something else because you're saying, okay, this is too much at the same time. I'm like, you didn't. It's if you are a Python programmer and you start learning JavaScript, many things are the same. Like objects are like objects, arrays are arrays, mutability is mutability, and stuff like that. Functions are functions, modules are modules. So you can, and the syntax is not that different. So you can take a lot when you move, and then you start to get this aha moments where you say, okay, this is different, and you take like a mental note of this is not like in Python. But you can start with, there's this saying like you can write Fortran in any language. I used to write C in any language until I learned Python, and now I used to try to write Python in any language, and then I learned Clojure, and the styles makes you try to code in a particular way because your mind gets used to thinking that way. My idea with FN is to let you bring a lot of the things you already know, and of course to clarify when something is different, but so you don't have to start from scratch learning everything, like the syntax, the tooling, and the concepts. I want to focus on making the tooling and the syntax as approachable as possible, and also having a lot of focus on errors and documentation and support and community, so you can focus on learning just the semantics of the Erlang ecosystem, which are the part that is different and the part that makes the Erlang ecosystem interesting. Because Erlang, the language, like the syntax, you're not going to learn Erlang because of the syntax, or you're not going to learn Erlang because of the tooling. The virtual machine allows you to do stuff that it's not as easy in other virtual machines or ecosystems. So I want to make a language that is so simple and so, like the Efene project is not only the compiler and the syntax and the language, but also the landing page, the documentation, the tutorials, the templates, the plugins. The Efene project is everything. All of that is a release of the Efene language. It's when I say 1.0, it means the language is ready, the compiler is ready, the error messages are clear, the templates are all up to date, the plugins are up to date, the documentation covers all the topics, and it's you have like tutorials and step-by-step guides. I want to make the first weeks with the language easy, so you can focus on learning what's different. These moments when you say, okay, this is different in Erlang. This is what I came for. So that's my idea with the project. And I think the Elixir community is doing the same for the people coming from Ruby in some sense, because the creator of Elixir, Jose Valim, is a core Ruby on Rails committer. So I think he's trying to make as easy as possible for the people coming from the Ruby on Rails community to land on the Erlang ecosystem and get on their feet and running as quickly and as easy as possible. Of course, if you try to write Ruby on Elixir, you will get these moments where you say, okay, this doesn't work like what I expected. But you are already running a website, a web server, doing queries to a database. So you already have something to show, and you're happy because you have something running, like a web server that replies and displays a website. And then you say, okay, it's worth to learn it and like interiorize it because it's worth it. And I'm already so far ahead with the language and I'm already productive that it's worth learning it. But if you get stuck the first day or the second day, or you see that in the second week you are still on the hello world and you don't understand anything, the chances that you will stay and you won't move to another programming language are really big. Are really not big, really low.
So, yeah, from your description of how you're trying to play that balancing act of making sure that the syntax is familiar enough, but not so much that it's deceptively familiar, seems like a pretty thin line to walk, but it sounds as though you're doing a pretty good job of that. But another thing that you mentioned, too, is that the tooling in the Erlang ecosystem is getting progressively better. And I know that part of that is because Erlang, the language in and of itself, has seen a bit of a recent rise in popularity, largely because of the scales that a lot of people are trying to operate at. And also, there have been a few success stories of companies who are using Erlang. So, for instance, WhatsApp, and then also the React database and RabbitMQ all being written in Erlang. And also, I know that part of the tooling is partly due to the fact that Elixir has been gaining a lot of popularity. And I know that the Ruby community has a pretty good focus on developer tooling, partly to play into their whole philosophy of developer happiness. And it seems that one of the benefits of writing a language that runs on the Beam is because, similar to JVM-based languages, all of those different ecosystems can interoperate because they all compile to the same bytecode. So, for instance, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can actually take libraries written in Elixir and in Erlang and utilize them directly in Efene without having to do any modifications.
Yep, that's right. Yep, so also the Elixir, here is a difference between my approach and the Elixir approach, which I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but just difference. On the Erlang side, what the Elixir people showed to the Erlang people, let's say, is that you could actually make it really improve programmer happiness on the Erlang virtual machine with not so many programmers. Because when the Elixir community started, there were a small group of people, really active group, but not that many. And they, in 1 or 2 years, they created a package manager and a release tool and a website where you could publish packages and a web framework and all this stuff. And this is only my idea, but they showed that if you really want to make it easier, simpler, and more user-friendly, you can. It's not a matter of the size of the community. But at the same time, it was already getting better. Basho, the company behind React, created Rebar that you may like it or not, but it solved the problem. It had some problems also, but it was better than what was there before, which was only makefiles. So some people picked up the work there. and created River 3, which was a rewrite of River that solved the problems that people were having. And also there's the Erlang MK project, which is a more Unix style build tool. So it improved along with the Elixir people. But then there was this back and forth and like cross-pollination where like since the Elixir people already had a package manager and a package format and some ideas, River 3 people said, okay, let's use that package manager and that format for the Erlang packages too. So there was this back and forth where all the tools kept improving with the work of both sides and the feedback of both sides. So it's been a good 2 or 3 years on the Erlang side in terms of tooling. Still a way to go, but quite nice compared to 3 or 4 years ago. And what makes difference with Efene between Elixir? Elixir has Mix and Hex and some other tool that I may be forgetting. The idea of Efene is to not have its own tools, but to use all the tools available on the Erlang side. So Efene works out of the box with River 3 and with Erlang MK. You just have to add one plugin on the configuration that comes already configured on the templates for the projects I have. And you are already running. You can mix Erlang code with Efene code, with LFE code, and it will work. So the idea is to not have a standard library. Usually, Elixir has some ideas of their own. It's the language that is the most different from the languages on the Erlang VM. So it's usual that some people, even when you can use Erlang libraries directly from Elixir, it's usual for people to wrap Erlang libraries to make them more Elixir-like. It's what also happens in Clojure. You can use Java libraries directly, but you can find wrappers for almost all the libraries, so they have like a Clojure feel. Elixir tend to do thin wrappers around Erlang libraries to have a more Elixir feel. The idea of Efene is that we don't have a standard library. Elixir has one, not that big, but has one. And we don't have Efene libraries. Libraries that are created with Efene can either be used directly from Erlang or even compiled to Erlang. If you want to write in Efene, but the build or the source code in GitHub and in your package manager be directly Erlang, it will be. We are not trying to create an ecosystem of tools and libraries inside of the Erlang ecosystem. We reuse everything that's available and try to. We are more in that sense. We are more like CoffeeScript to JavaScript. And Elixir will be like Clojure to Java. They are farther ahead because Elixir also has concepts of their own that they take from the Clojure side, which are protocols, where you can implement a protocol for a data type and it will work across all the data types that implement that protocol, which is really cool, but requires you to do some extra compiling magic in the middle, like Scala and Clojure have to do. But Efene is just straight compiling. Each line of Efene is one line of Erlang, and there's no overhead, there's no intermediate generation of code behind the scenes that does something extra. It's just straight Erlang. You can even compile Efene code instead of bytecode to Erlang. So in that case, it's more like a CoffeeScript.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that you could so easily transpile Efene to the Erlang syntax. And it's also an interesting standpoint to, like you said, not have a standard library and not try to build up a community specifically of Efene users, just to basically provide a bridge to people who want to come into the Erlang ecosystem to make that initial step a little friendlier, and then maybe either continue using Efene and stay there, or just move further and just use Erlang directly. So
exactly. As I said at some point, I don't care if Efene is a gateway drug in some sense, where you start with Efene and then realize that yeah, now I understand Erlang because it's one-to-one. Now only I have to learn the syntax, and I can stop using this plugin, and I can use straight Erlang. I really don't care. It's my way of helping the community get bigger and more diverse by trying to bring these people from Python and JavaScript that are afraid maybe when they see Erlang. So that's the whole idea. And try not to duplicate work because I'm not trying to in that sense, I'm not trying to create a third community like the Erlang guys, the Elixir guys, and the Efene guys. I'm not trying to do that. I think the Elixir people are doing a great job at creating a language that has its own ideas and its own community. So I'm not trying to create a third group. I'm just on the Erlang side of things.
And in a couple of points, you've alluded to some of the benefits that the Beam provides that are hard to replicate in languages like Python. So I'm curious if you can give a bit more detail about what some of those benefits are and why a Python developer might want to consider using Efene or Elixir to take advantage of them.
Yeah, the reason I came for is, as everyone may think, and that was actually the case, concurrency. But when you get in for the concurrency, you stay for the fault tolerance. So there's some people that say I came for the concurrencies and stayed for the fault tolerance, because that's the most interesting part. Of course, the scalability and the concurrency is great, but the fault tolerance is the thing, other than immutability, the thing that makes that Erlang changed your way of seeing the programming world. The concept of actors and supervisors and message passing and supervisor trees and crash early and often, and a supervisor will pick up the crash and will restart, and you have these supervisor hierarchies and the restart policies, and everything like starts crashing because there's some problem, and then the supervisors restart everything from a known state, and you get everything back. Because there's even a paper that says like 99 of the software bugs are transient. Like if you retry it enough times, they go away, and if they don't go away, then you should keep crashing until you reach the top supervisor, and if it keeps crashing, then you crash the VM because there's nothing to do. But all this idea, and not only the idea as a pattern, like maybe you could create this in other languages, but the VM is created for that. So immutability helps because one actor cannot change something in another actor, like this spooky action at a distance that you have on mutable languages, which are like almost all of them. And also message passing. Actors, you cannot inspect what's inside an actor, and you can only modify it by sending it messages, and you can only send messages if you have the process ID. And also each process, since it's receiving messages from a message box, inside the process, it's acting serially. So it takes a message, handles it, then takes the next message and handles it. So inside the process, you are not thinking about concurrency. But when you start to assemble all these process hierarchies and networks of processes sending messages to processes, you get the concurrency for free because the VM does preemptive scheduling of processes for you, and you have like lightweight threads, so lightweight processes actually. So you don't have to think about how many are these too many processes I'm spawning. You don't care because you can spawn millions of processes without a problem. Which there's I think the creator of Erlang said, when he was creating Erlang, said, imagine that you're programming Python and I say to you, you can only have 1,000 objects. Like how your way of designing the program will change if you could only create 1,000 objects. It's the same with all the programming languages in terms of concurrency. You can only create, some thousands of threads before you start having problems. In Erlang, you can create millions and you don't have these problems. And also the VM, since it does the preemptive scheduling, one process cannot affect the other process, because if it takes too long to execute some message handling, it will be sent to the back of the queue. So that's nice also. And the fact that the GC on Erlang is per process. So each process has a really small heap, and it grows as needed. And each process does garbage collection on its own heap. So you don't have a global, unique, huge heap that will stop the world to garbage collect gigabytes of data. So that's cool also. So all these ideas are the ones that you don't. When someone says Erlang, they say, like concurrency and scalability because of the concurrency. But all of these details, also one that it's really interesting is the degree of introspection, runtime introspection you can do on an Erlang system. You can connect via shell to a running system, even via SSH if you want. There's a blog post over there. And start like inspecting and see the live process tree, and you can even stop processes and inspect what they have inside and all this stuff, which is really useful when you're running a really complex system. And finally, since you're doing all these message passing and you only have a process ID to send a message, it doesn't matter if the process is on this computer, on this core, on another core, or another computer on the data center. So the scalability from one core to 16 cores and from one server to 15 servers is use the same abstractions. And one I didn't mention, but many people think it will be more interesting, and I thought so, but I still didn't make so much use of it, is hot call reloading. Since you have all this immutable thing and no like global heap, you compile a new version of a module, you reload it, and the code will reload, of course, with the procedure. It's really useful if you want to have a high availability, but if you can you have to do some steps to achieve this. You have to write code to handle the migration from one version to a next version, and the migration back from the next version to the version before in case the upgrade fails. So it's there, but people normally only use it when it's really needed, when you are running stuff like WhatsApp or React or stuff like that. It's not something you say, okay, I will start a blog with the backend in Erlang. I will do hot call reloading, because you can restart. It's easier to restart at the beginning.
Yeah. Speaking to your point about fault tolerance, I can't remember exactly the company. I think it might have been, I want to say Sony's Ericsson, but there was some company who, using Erlang, was able to achieve 9 nines of uptime because of the Erlang VM and its reliability.
Yeah, it's Ericsson. They created a telephone switch, a hardware switch using Erlang. And there, every second you are not handling calls, you get a fine because it's regulated. So yeah, they achieved on that switch 9 nines of availability. And also Erlang, that's maybe the point where it shines. It's used in this high availability, high scalability services. That's why you can see like databases and message queues and MQTT brokers and all these backbones. Also, Amazon S3 is done with Erlang. All these like backbone services that you would expect are highly available to be written in Erlang because of these concepts and the way of approaching and solving a problem that allow you to have these properties.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting ecosystem, and one that I continue to want to find a reason to program in, but I have not yet found the time and the motivation to do so. So I understand that you are also experimenting with another language implementation that runs on the Beam. I'm wondering if you can give a brief description of what that is and how it compares to Efene and what inspired you to start that project.
Sure. So as I said, Efene is a conservative language. It tries to be simple, not. I don't want to invent anything new with the language, with the tools, with anything, with the syntax. It tries to be really conservative. But as I was developing Efene, I had all these crazy ideas, and I had like a backlog in my mind of all these crazy ideas I wanted to try in a language. And at some point I say, okay, what if I bring all these crazy ideas into a language? Of course, that won't be Efene because it will turn into a crazy language. So one day I had a really long wait times on airports. Like I had, I don't know, half a day coming back to Germany. So I said, okay, let's try these ideas and see if they all together fit into one language that makes some sense. And that became Interfix. It's an experimental programming language. Experimental in the sense that I try some things that may not be good ideas, but I wanted to try them in one language. It's experimental in that sense, but in the sense of if it works, yeah, it compiles, and it may be a little bit behind Efene in terms of stability, but I've tried it and I've written some code, and there's people that have written code in Interfix, and yeah, it works. I keep Interfix as a place or a project for people that want to experiment with alternative ways of writing programs, but always in the syntax part. It compiles also straight to Erlang bytecode and can cross-compile or transpile to Erlang source code, so you can see what the meaning of the thing is. And yeah, there's no overhead. Like each feature of the language is compiles directly to a feature of the Erlang language. It's let's say it's a crazy syntax that compiles to Erlang bytecode. But I really like what I really like about the language is that when you read some examples, it looks like it can't compile to something. That can't be, because my idea was to use as the least amount of punctuation as possible without resorting to the Lisp trick of using parentheses. Mm-hmm. So it's like a Lisp without the parentheses. And the language is quite interesting. I suggest you to check the examples on the README and the examples folder to see what it looks like. And I can assure you that all the examples compile to something. Of course, some source codes, the thing that the program is actually doing are not useful, but everything compiles to actual code that can run.
And just bringing it back around a bit, so there are definitely plenty of benefits to using the Erlang VM and the Erlang ecosystem. I'm wondering if there are any cases that you can think of where you would not want to use Erlang or an Erlang language and would rather use Python because it's either easier or more effective.
Yeah, there are. If you are doing like something where Python shines, which is scientific computing, numeric stuff, don't use Erlang because in the math part it's slow, so it doesn't make sense. And also there are some algorithms that are much more efficient if you use mutation. You create an array and sort it in place, replacing the values that are in the array. If you are using a mutable algorithm, you will be creating one new object per change. Of course, if you use something like structural sharing, you are not creating that much new memory, but it's slower, much slower. So in the part of numerics and like scientific computing and calculations and machine learning and all that stuff, don't use it. And also for scripting, even if you could, there's no reason, I think, because Python, and I think if I have to write a script, I will write it in Python. I use Python for glue, basically. Or if I have to do something quick, I use Python. Erlang is more if you want to take advantage of the Erlang VS, as you said, and play to the strengths of the platform. Maybe there are people doing like Erlang backends and then putting Ruby on Rails on front or Python on front with Django to do the front end of the backend in some sense on that language, those languages. Even if you can do it in Erlang, and you could if you wanted, but as I said, for scripting, for numerical stuff, I think you shouldn't use. And if you want to create a desktop application, I wouldn't use Erlang either. Of course, for websites and for web services, it's great. And for, I say backbone, I don't know how like databases and message queues and all that is great. But for desktop applications, for scripts, and for numerical stuff, I wouldn't recommend it.
So, are there any questions that I didn't ask that you think I should have, or anything else that you'd like to bring up before we move on?
I cannot think of one. Okay. No, it's it.
So, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow what you're up to, what would be the best way for them to do that? Or anybody, if they're asking for advice on how to get involved with Efene and the Erlang ecosystem?
You can, I guess you will write this on the notes because
yes.
I won't spell it. I'm Mariano Guerra on Twitter. I'm Mariano Guerra in GitHub. MarianoGuerra.org is my blog. Those will be the 3 entry points. And for if you're interested particularly on Efene, go to efene.org and first contact me directly, and so I can help you because I've been working on the language for the last year and a half to have a 1.0 beta. Like the first release will be 1.0 beta because the language is almost finished actually. But of course, I don't want to come out with a 1.0 because there may be problems. The only reason I don't do the release is because I want to improve the documentation and I want to do the release when I have free time to support the people that come. But if you want to be an early adopter and help me like polish the product before the release, just contact me on those channels and I will gladly help you to get started with Efene and with any question you may have.
Excellent. So with that, we will move on into the picks. And for my picks today, my first one is a project that I came across recently because I just started a new job and got a new computer for it and needed to set up my dot files all over again, and decided to take the opportunity to see if there was a better way that I could go about it than what I was currently using. And so I found a project called Dot Files, spelled DOTPHILES, and it's just a collection of dot files for various things such as Zeesh and Bash and your Python RC and git config and all of that kind of stuff. And it's a really good starting point, a lot of good utility in there. And so I've forked that and made it my own a bit and have been enjoying using that so far. And my next pick today is a conference talk video that I watched a little while ago called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Dynamic Typing for Practical Programs. And it's a discussion of the static versus dynamic typing argument that's been going on for ages, and has a lot of really cogent points about how static typing is good for solving certain sets of problems, but in the whole, dynamic typing is at least equally as good at a number of those same problems, particularly in terms of the accuracy and reliability of code, as long as you're practicing proper unit testing techniques and not relying solely on manual testing. So the gains that you get from static typing don't necessarily outweigh the gains you get from dynamic typing, and in some cases can also be detrimental because of the upfront cognitive load necessary for having to decide all of your types ahead of time and how all of that is going to play out throughout your entire application. So definitely recommend giving that a look, particularly for people who are firmly in the Python camp. And with that, I will pass it to you, Mariano. What have you got for picks today?
In terms of software, one thing I've been creating lately a small to medium size application using I don't know if it's a framework, but a library from ClojureScript, the Clojure dialect that compiles to JavaScript, called OmNext. It's on alpha currently, so you may get burned, but it's quite stable. I've been using it and the product works, and I hadn't had any surprises with it. I recommend you to check David Nolan's talks about OmNext and the reasons behind the project, because also it's a really novel approach to creating UIs on your browser. I don't know if I will be able to go back to JavaScript after creating a UI with OmNext, because it makes so many things that in JavaScript are a pain so simple that it's addictive in some sense. Of course, there may be applications where you need like extreme performance where you cannot use it, but for simple applications, for experiments, for applications that don't require extreme performance on the front end side, I think OmNext is really, really interesting. And as a result, I recommend you to check ClojureScript if you don't like JavaScript and are looking for something else to create your front ends, because sadly Python doesn't have a good story on compile to JavaScript. There are many projects trying to, but I don't think there's one like production ready like ClojureScript is. And also something I'm checking, it's also quite new. It's a project called The Things Network. It's a project that started in the Netherlands. Some people found a new protocol and some devices. The protocol is called LoRaWAN, that allows really low energy devices that can live with a battery for like years to send really small amounts of data, but for long distances. So they did an experiment in Amsterdam, and I think it worked. And they created a Kickstarter campaign to create a really cheap what they call a gateway, that is a device like a Wi-Fi router that you connect to in your home, and can cover theoretically 10 kilometers, circle area of 10 kilometers. Mm-hmm. That means it can receive messages from 10 kilometers around lines of sight. In a city, it reduces to like 3 kilometers, but it's a lot. And some development kits and devices to make it easy for people to experiment with this technology. And the Kickstarter was successful. They are launching the Things Gateway in July, I think. And I find it really interesting. I'm looking into it. Yesterday, I gave a talk about the protocol. In my blog post, I wrote a short description of the protocol, how it works and what it does and what it doesn't do and stuff like that. I recommend you to check it, because I think I'm always thinking on doing something with like sensors sending information and then showing it somewhere else. But if you use Arduino or Raspberry Pi or BeagleBone, you have to have a power source, and they all rely on Wi-Fi or something like that. So you cannot create one of these and put it on a field or on a tree or on a river, because it won't work. And I find this a really interesting alternative. Of course, it's the protocol is new and the devices are new and the project is new. So I'm not saying everything works. I'm exploring it, and I recommend you to check it also.
Well, again, I definitely appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me and tell us all more about Efene and why we should consider using it for some of our projects. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoy your rest of your day too.
Okay.